Welcome to this webinar in the series on e-commerce, trade and development, policy frameworks in Africa. Today, we will talk about the digital transformation of international trade from a trade law perspective. How can data governance and trade law come together to ensure that borders do not unduly hinder the cross-border data flows that are needed for cross-border commerce? And how do we reconcile this with protecting privacy and security? To discuss this from a development perspective, we are delighted to have with us Neha Mishra and Rutendo Tavengerwei. Neha has recently written a book on data governance and trade law, where she not only spells out and analyzes the issues, but also offers very practical solutions. Neha is assistant professor in the International Law Department of the Geneva Graduate Institute. She is a qualified lawyer in India and the UK, and has previously worked with law firms and technology companies in the UK, India, and Singapore. Rutendo is a PhD candidate in law at the University of Oxford. Her research explores the intersection between data regulation and economic development, examining which legal frameworks best support Africa's economic potential. Before I give the floor to Rutendo, a few housekeeping rules. The webinar is recorded and will be posted on CEP's YouTube channel, and there you will also find previous webinars. The format of the webinar will be a conversation between the two panelists in 3 thematic sections. So the 3 themes will be a role of trade to bridge the digital divide, and then freedom of countries to regulate and the practicality of interoperability, and finally reflections on the African continental free trade area. So the 3 sections will be interrupted by questions from the audience. So feel free to post your question in the chat channel and we will pick them up. So without further ado, I give the floor to Rutendo. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Hildegard. As Hildegard mentioned, I am joined by Neha today, and I'm very excited to be talking to you about the book, but about digital trade and developing countries and African countries in particular, which are my specific passion. So as Hildegard mentioned as well, we shall be doing this in 3 stages. So we'll start now with the segment on the role of trade to bridge the digital divide. And let me get started on your book, Neha. First of all, congratulations. That's a very big achievement and well done to you. So let's just start by talking about what inspired you to write this particular book at this time in the evolution of digital trade, and what gaps you were aiming to address with your research.
Thank you so much, Rutendo, and also big thank you to CEP, especially Hildegard, for hosting us for this session. And I'm really excited to chat with Rutendo and learn more also about the African perspectives on some of the topics that we are going to discuss. So to answer your question, Rutendo, I have been discussing and writing and thinking about digital trade for a long time, for almost a decade. And what I've seen is that the space has dramatically evolved from being a very niche area with very few people. It has expanded to include a lot more people and from different walks of life and different areas of not just law, but different areas of social sciences. And while it was very clear, even from the early days of the WTO, that when there was this whole dialogue on e-commerce since the mid-90s, There was clarity that it would directly or indirectly interface with trade law, and also that it would increasingly envelop a lot of internet and data regulation issues. The reason why I thought of writing this book was because I thought the interface that was being seen between trade law and data governance had really spread a lot more than what was the case 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So I thought there were two key reasons, therefore, to think about it in a different way. The first one was because I think there was so much of discussion around how does WTO law apply, how do FTA rules apply, and the entire discussion was around how do they apply to digital trade barriers, but a broader discussion as to what this interface means and what are the prospects for trade law being shaped by data governance and vice versa was not always captured in those dialogues. And the second reason was a bit more personal. For the last 3 or 4 years, I think a lot of narratives that we hear are on digital fragmentation, national security, digital mistrust, and that seems to be overshadowing any positive role that trade law and policy can play in this space, including whether it can boost regulatory cooperation, stronger alignment, facilitate digital development, build mechanism for digital trust. And I wanted to use the book to explore these ideas from a more pragmatic basis.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I agree with what you're saying as well, that in the past 10 years, we've seen a shift, right? Even in the way that trade agreements are being negotiated now. You find not only chapters of digital trade in an FTA, but now even standalone digital trade agreements, right? Like we've seen more and more of that as we've been going on. And now even to talk about some regional blocs like, the African Union having the AFCFTA, that is an indication of just how important and relevant this area is becoming, or is actually not is becoming, because I mean we're living in times that are very potent with technological development. It's inevitable that trade needs to go that way, or rather that is already going that way, and there's a need to regulate. One thing I also enjoyed about your book is that you focus on developing countries. There's a developing country undertone going on, like as you discussing different issues. Can you unpack for us how this specific perspective shaped your analysis, especially when we're talking about the relationship with regards to data, the data divide and digital competition?
Yeah, so I think this was also a very conscious choice. I believe a lot of people would be aware of this, that when we talk about mainstream digital trade scholarship, it usually is a discussion on the digital kingdoms or the digital empires, and that's typically the EU, the United States, and China. And I often found this very troubling, because if you think of where all the digital users live, it is a large part of the developing world that does not get featured in many of these discussions. Similarly, even from a trade law perspective, if you hear a lot of discussion around how does WTO law apply or how do certain FTA rules apply, the discussions are generally around measures that are implemented by these digital powers, but there's very little understanding of what happens. In fact, there's very little understanding of also how different countries are trying to respond to trade law and accommodating and adjusting within the system. Of course, from a developing country perspective, there was writing focused on digital and data colonialism, but I feel those scholars often either did not talk much about trade law and policy, or were extremely critical about it and did not really see if it could bring about any benefits. So in terms of writing this book, I was very clear that that was a perspective that needed to be reflected. Now, so there are 2 chapters in the book where I specifically look at the global data divide and digital competition. And of course, you're free to read it. The book is available, open access actually online. But I wanted to highlight some common strains of thought that I had across both the chapters on this developing country aspect. So the first thing that I wanted to highlight through the book was that developing countries are not a uniform category. They are really at different stages of development. Some of the developing countries actually are better advanced than some of the developed countries in terms of their digital prowess. They have different market sizes, different potential to engage in digital trade, different kinds of resources, digital infrastructure, local talent. And therefore, the model of integration that they might seek in terms of the global digital economy might really vary from country to country. I also thought it was quite a myth that a lot of people who talk about digital protectionism think it's limited to some developing countries and LDCs. It's actually a myth because most of the powerful digital economies also implement a lot of measures which are highly protectionist. And that's something that I wanted to highlight through especially those two chapters of the book. And also a lot of developing and developed countries have shared concerns in relation to data governance, including things like competition in the digital economy. This is not just a developing country concern. The third strain of thought, which is again quite common through different chapters of the book, is that when we think about special and differential treatment, capacity building, technical assistance, technology transfer, it's important to remember how much potential is there in the developing countries in terms of the market that they have. And therefore, when we think of these provisions, I don't think the right language is that of charity or voluntary obligations or something like that, but it is very much a reciprocal bargaining process. And that's something that I brought out through some of the proposals that I made in the book. There was a fourth strain of thought, I think, that is common to, especially to both these chapters, is that it not beyond just WTO or trade law bodies, it's important to think how these developing countries and LDCs can participate in different fora, including on standard setting or different aspects of digital governance. And that's that's one area where they still don't have enough of a powerful voice, which is missing in the global dialogues. And the last point that I think is also a common thread through the book, at least to some extent, is that because in an individual or in an individual capacity, a lot of developing countries and LDCs may not be able to have a strong, meaningful voice. Regional mechanisms might be more powerful than isolated voices. So I think these were the strains of thought which are common, and therefore the proposals that I make in these two chapters particularly reflect these ideas.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, especially when you're talking about the differences in, as we know in the trade world, that developing countries are not the same. And those differences sometimes can cause fragmentation in the way that negotiations are done, especially if we're doing them in a multilateral space like the WTO. So then you end up having even a fragmented voice, which we'll talk about just now. But I want to take us to how to kind of bring synergy, right, in how developing countries can work together in this space. So when we're talking about South-South cooperation, right, especially in the context of the US-China, tensions right now, do you think that there are any opportunities for South-South cooperation outside of this very big, power rivalry? And if that's the case, then what would that mean when thinking about, the role of China in digital trade in most developing countries? I'd be very interested to hear what you think.
I think I already indicated there is an optimistic undertone in my book. I do think there are prospects for South-South cooperation. I especially think ASEAN, although ASEAN, of course, has also some very developed countries within its membership, but still, I think ASEAN is a great example because it has many developing countries and even a few LDCs as well. And they have been incrementally building upon their framework, at least at a regional level. I also think countries that take leadership on developing countries issues, whether it's at the WTO or in other fora, there is a certain degree of responsibility to accurately represent the views. And I'm just going to give one classic example here, which is the e-commerce moratorium discussion at the WTO, where I think it is important for any developing country, whether it's India, South Africa, because they are very powerful developing countries. And therefore, to bring about a more reasoned analysis of these dialogues, because sometimes they can be skewed in one direction or the other. And it's also important to remember, for instance, what works for India does not always work for Rwanda or for Kenya, because they're all very different kinds of digital economies. Now, in light of the deepening US-China tensions, trade war, tech war, that does complicate the scenario, I think, particularly for two reasons. First is because traditionally what we have seen is that some developing countries tend to take a more softer stance towards the US, and some developing countries and LDCs tend to be more influenced by China, and that itself creates, or that's a prospect for fragmentation when US and China are very divided and they are on opposite sides. And that also makes it harder for these South-South countries to negotiate trade deals, because they can be completely on the opposite sides of the spectrum. But what we're also seeing in today's world is that the priorities on digital trade, whether it's of the United States or China, are shifting, and it's kind of a little hard at the moment to predict how this evolves. So I think that creates one layer of complication. And I think the second layer of complication is that this ongoing tech war, particularly since the beginning of this year, when it has, I think, started becoming even more fierce, we don't know whether there will be winners or losers, or who will be the winners and losers. But one thing that is for sure is that developing countries always suffer when big powers are fighting with each other. It could be in terms of higher prices, fragmented markets. And I heard something very funny, which I can't remember who said, but it's a famous Chinese proverb which says that whether elephants fight with each other or they make love with each other, the grass always suffers. Just to say that, if we think carefully, irrespective of who wins this trade war, a lot of developing countries and LDCs are going to pay the cost of the war, the ongoing tech war and trade war. And if you think of the next generation technology, especially AI, where we have so much discussion and conflict around semiconductors, this just becomes worse. The AI divide is worse, will probably be worse than the digital divide we see today. Specifically on the role of China, I know a lot of recent writing has focused on how digital powers like China can push their regulatory and market agenda through these projects, giant projects such as the Digital Silk Road. But there is also some nuanced writing which challenges this conventional view. So for instance, there was some writing by Matthew Airy. I think they wrote a long piece by Matthew Airy and Thomas Trines, and they were looking at how Digital Silk Road was being implemented in Pakistan. And what they found was that it was not a one-sided or one-way forcing down of regulatory standards or norms, but there was a lot of push and pull involved in this process. And I think, therefore, we need to also refine our understanding of this dependency that we think exists between China or US or EU and other developing countries and LDCs, because it actually can be quite nuanced in practice.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And it's linked quite a bit to the research that I'm doing right now, that it's not as black and white as sometimes we are inclined to believe that it is. There's a lot of gray areas there in terms of dependency, because even if agency is constrained, most times, it actually does exist, and maybe doesn't end up in the kind of outcomes that we would rather be there. But in a way, it is disheartening, but it is sort of to be expected when you're dealing with a big economy and a smaller economy. That kind of push and pull, that kind of tension does exist. But at the same time, I think also what I'd like to add to what you said is that I think for true South-South cooperation to actually exist, we do need to build that voice that you talked about, right? Which is difficult, granted, because there's different levels of development and priorities and even strategies in terms of economies, which is fair. But I think what also then inclines us to that dependency in codes is that we negotiate as individual countries. And obviously, if you are a country like Rwanda or Zimbabwe, negotiating with the US, the bargaining power is very different there. And so I think to be able to move beyond dependency, we do need to have a shared form of solidarity in the developing country group as a whole. And I'm just thinking specifically about how this applies to the African region specifically, and that interests me because I find the AFCFTA as a very potent platform to do that for the African bloc. Like that has not always been the case, that the region negotiates as a unit, but it can be now, especially with digital trade rules already having been negotiated. I mean, we're still waiting on the text of the annex, but we do have some rules having come out now, and for it to be more than a symbolic gesture, that needs to concretize, and it's a long way coming. I don't think it's something that can be achieved overnight, but it's definitely not impossible. But then again, like what you said, I think another thing that then also distresses me in a way is the fact that there are real constraints, right? We're talking about, for example, China let me give an example of in the African region. We have very serious funding and capacity constraints and gaps, which then a country like China is able to come in and offer to cover. And on top of that, so then you have projects that might be more aligned with the Chinese government because they need to get something out of it, and they might not necessarily be top of the priority for some of the African countries. And then you have on top of that fragmented regulation and the geopolitical pushback. If you're looking at maybe forming a concretized voice or a united voice like the FCFTA, and then you make standards and maybe they offend a big economies like the US, who already see what the US is doing right now with the tariff war. So it's not easy, but I also think it's not impossible. Though I do think the starting point would be trying to kind of get countries to have kind of a foundational, agreement in the developing country group as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And one of my colleagues, Kolofela Kugler, and I had written about this in the context of the Digital Trade Protocol, that and using a very much African philosophy of Ubuntu, that there is a need to understand there are a lot of shared goals and interests, and they are not just, again, voluntary or moral, but they are very strategic interests which can be put together to deal with bigger digital powers, because an individual African country may not have a strong voice, but African continent as a whole, it's the last market to be kind of explored as a digital market, and there are immense opportunities, and there is a reason why Chinese companies and EU companies and US companies obviously are trying as much as possible to enter these markets, whether it's by coercion or whether it's through friendly agreements. So there is a hidden potential there. But I think it was also difficult because in addition to the differences in ideologies and understandings of digital regulation, there are also political problems and very pragmatic constraints that you mentioned about funding. And a very simple example is that in Africa, and this is something that I found out very late, it's very hard to sometimes get a flight from one African country to another African country. You often have to fly to Brussels or Paris and then again come back, which it doesn't seem like a big constraint, but it is a big constraint if you're actually trying to do business within the continent. So there are very basic logistics issues to be dealt with as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the last thing that I want to add, because I'm conscious of the time, and I think we ought to move to address any questions if there are any from the audience. But the last thing I'll say is, one, mm, I will say misconception for lack of a better word, because I can't think of anything right now. But one misconception is that just because we, as developing country people, or in this case, I'll say Africa, are largely consumers in this space, there's the usual misconception that then there's nothing for us to do in terms of policy making and regulation. But again, going back to the thing that I think I will keep saying throughout this chat is, if we have a united voice, there's more to be said about someone who, people who are actually the consumers, because then you can insist on certain standards and the way that things are done. But that only works if you're united. If you're doing it as single, individual countries, that's more difficult. I think that's the last thing that I'll say. But we'll go back to Hildegard in case there's any questions that have come in that you'd like to highlight for us.
I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A or the chat, but
Okay.
I pose a question myself, which is more about the nature of data and the digital divide. So data are quite different from goods and services in the sense that you cannot really own data, and it's also what we call non-exclusive. So the fact that one consumer used the data doesn't prevent another from using the data at the same time. So how do you think about this kind of different nature of data in terms of trade law and governance? How does it differ from, say, trading goods in terms of how you kind of govern and draw laws in this space? I guess I ask both of you.
Rutendo, if you wish to, you can go first.
I think there's no straight answer to this one, because I think it's something that is still even being figured out by, in this space by governments and policymakers and how they regulate, but even in academia. It's not the easiest question to answer, so I'll say that first. But then also, that being said, I think you raise a good point there, Hildegard, because another thing that also comes to mind is just how differently countries understand data and so then regulate, right? So let me use the example of the three big powers, right, with digital empires, if you like, the US, EU, and China, right? So we have the US viewing data more as an economic asset, and then that shows in how they regulate, and mostly in terms of like self-regulation and business first. You have the Googles and Amazons kind of like leading how regulations are set in the US, and then you have China viewing it mostly as a national resource of sorts. So they're more inclined to regulate in terms of national security and sovereignty and that kind of thing. And then you have the EU viewing it as a fundamental right. So then, or in terms of personal data, that is. So you have also that leading how, for example, the GDPR, even how it shows up in FTAs. The EU has shown up in FTAs. So I think that makes it very difficult to regulate, right? Because we're already coming at it from very different angles. And I think for that to be resolved, there has to be some sort of common understanding of what data is. Because then if that's done, then we can kind of have the next move would be then how do you regulate it? Because already if we're talking about different things when we're talking about, but we're using the same language, then there's no way to regulate in the same way. There's unavoidable fragmentation because of that. I don't know, Neha, do you wanna jump in?
Yeah, if I were to wear a very traditional trade lawyer hat, I would say that there's no need to, get frustrated. A lot of rules within WTO treaties and FTAs still very much apply to a lot of data flows because they are embedded in, trade and services and trade and goods. And therefore, particularly in the context of trade and services, you can look at a lot of disciplines and see how they apply in practice. But the reality is that because of the nature of data being so complex, and also there are, there are ways of categorizing data. For instance, you can put data as personal data and non-personal data, but again, the distinction between those two categories is not so clear, and how countries would address it would also be very different in practice. Even if it's theoretically possible to apply trade rules, which is something I also argue in my book, theoretically, of course, a lot of disciplines might apply. In reality, you're looking at questions which are no longer in the trade law domain. You're starting to move to the data governance, data regulation domain, which is where the sensitivity really lies. And it's very hard for trade bodies to then talk about, what are the right standards for personal data protection, or how do we ensure data security, because these are not topics where countries share a universal consensus. At least to a great extent, they don't share a universal consensus. So it's complex, but I think just as a trade lawyer would probably argue that it's possible to use the existing disciplines. And especially if you look at the FTAs and the digital trade chapters, which contain quite a lot of disciplines relevant to cross-border data flows, we are not doing that badly. I think that's how they would like to respond. But I think the problem with applying those rules is a lot of things that you raised, Rutendo, that different countries look at it differently, and they are very strategic, political, and often national security concerns for countries. So even if trade law applies, and even if you could have a dispute and a decision in a dispute, there is no guarantee that it would be implemented in practice.
Just picking up on the dispute, there is a question in the Q&A or in the chat asking exactly about that. So would the WTO's dispute mechanism apply to arbitrate between different kinds of national policy on cross-border data restrictions? I guess if the dispute resolution actually worked.
But I think another avenue that is still very much unexplored is that a lot of FTAs now have binding rules on cross-border data flows and data localization, and the dispute resolution mechanisms are applicable in many. Of course, there are some FTAs which exclude them from the scope of dispute settlement. And perhaps that's the next frontier where we might see disputes in relation to measures that restrict cross-border data flows. But I have a feeling, just like it was at the WTO, this is not going to be such a rapid process, because I think irrespective of how countries view data, I think majority of countries are restricting cross-border data flows in different ways. And so it's a bit like I live in a glass house kind of a situation. So no one wants to really take the risk of challenging these measures because they are equally vulnerable to similar challenges.
Yeah. I think the only thing that I would add to the question that came up in the chat is that it's quite difficult, obviously, at the WTO for this to be something that you take to the appellate body or even to the panelists, because we don't have clear rules. We don't have multilateral rules. We don't have agreement on how this should be regulated at all. We don't have a multilateral instrument, right? And so what does that mean in terms of, how countries are regulating in their national capacities or even in FTAs? It's quite complicated, because the rules that we have, like GATT and GATS, don't cover that, right? They don't cover the nuances that exist in digital trade. But at the same time, like what Neha is saying, we do have binding rules in FTAs, which is a good thing, but at the same time, it can also be a complicated thing. So I think the role of the WTO in this space is still quite unclear, as far as we don't have a multilateral instrument. But it's not irrelevant at the same time, if that makes sense, because it's still an evolving space. At least that is the hopeful the hopefulness in me saying that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we can move on to the next session then.
Okay. So please do keep those questions coming in the chat. We'll take again some few questions in a bit, but now we're entering into the second segment, which is on freedom of countries to regulate and the practicality of interoperability. So this is a bit of a big topic, but we'll try to do it justice for me, Neha. So the first question I'll pose to you, Neha, is so how can countries balance the imperative to protect their national interests through regulation with the need to ensure interoperability in digital markets? Because there's a bit of a tension there, and it's not as easy to do both.
Yeah. I think it's one of the most, probably one of the most difficult and also one of the most important question for digital trade rulemaking, because as we have discussed, kind of already discussed, we see countries now riding very high on this digital and data sovereignty agenda, which then becomes a basis to impose all kinds of barriers to digital flows, data flows. And there are a lot of policy concerns that are being brought to the forefront, some of which are indeed very sensitive in practice, and some of which are just a cover for protectionism. We've also seen there is a lot more writing these days about regulatory fragmentation in the global digital economy, because countries have started taking very isolated unilateral measures to protect their national interests. And in light of all that, we have seen a bunch of trade policy makers, lawyers, and experts coming up with a somewhat technocratic sounding solution of interoperability, that as countries can have different regulatory frameworks, doesn't matter as long as they interoperate with each other. And most people would know that this actually comes from the computing sciences, where technical systems interoperate using common protocols. So the translation of this in the regulatory context is that regulatory frameworks could do the same thing even if they have different rules in place. And it's seen as being more reasonable as compared to regulatory harmonization, which is obviously very difficult in such a complex environment. In my book, I do actually bring up the idea of regulatory interoperability, because I think it has a lot of things need to be explored under this idea, but it's not as simplistic as saying that let's have interoperable regulations. For me, I think the first step of understanding regulatory interoperability is really mapping different regulatory frameworks and seeing what are the areas where you can have common principles and norms, what are the shared interests, when there's similar vocabulary, what does that mean in practice? Because unless you have these basics in place, you cannot have regulatory interoperability in a particular area. And it's also one thing in a high level agreement, especially in digital economy agreements, we see a lot of language around interoperability. Often that's just more focus on technical interoperability. But even for technical interoperability to function, you need a certain degree of regulatory interoperability. So what we have, I think the idea of regulatory interoperability is not that new. If you think of what EU and US have been doing for personal data transfer arrangements for several years, it is very much a interoperability building mechanism. But so far, I think the story of regulatory interoperability has pretty much just focused on those two jurisdictions. I haven't seen that much work outside of that. I think another prospect that remains underexplored is whether we can develop common standards in certain areas. So for instance, in relation to privacy and cybersecurity, I talk quite a bit about having common data certification standards, data categorization mechanisms, which can enable, at least at a high level, to achieve some degree of consensus. One issue, I think, which is very specific to trade law, the way trade lawyers think, is that a lot of these standards or best practices that we are seeing on how to have more interoperable mechanisms often come from transnational bodies or high level frameworks. Sometimes they are multi-stakeholder frameworks, and they do not fit very neatly into a very stereotypical multilateral trade framework. And especially now that we are talking about, politicization around the digital world, we're especially seeing for AI and, quantum technologies, all the next generation technologies, a lot of players are also trying to capture standard setting discussions, whether it's happening in private standard setting bodies or at the, international organizations such as the ITU. So one idea I had proposed, particularly in the cybersecurity context, was, why not look at something like the Code of Good Practice, which is under the TBT agreement, and apply that not just to the goods context, but to the digital economy as a whole. And I think this idea is not something which has been explored in depth. But yeah, I think there are prospects, but as I said, you need to think of the costs and benefits of interoperability, and you need to be cautious, because there are certain areas where interoperability may not be that perfect, may not be that functional, or may take a long time to evolve, and maybe through a slow bottom-up process.
Yeah, and I think also taking us back to, the point that I made earlier about just the different conceptions of some of these things, for example, what data is, right? Which then leads to how the regulations in their entirety by a specific country might turn up because of how they're understanding, for example, data in this case to be. I think they, like what you're saying, they do needs to be like common understandings of certain things, but also at the same time, I agree with you that it's not impossible, because we don't necessarily, especially seeing how it has been in the past years, right? Even just at the WTO with the struggle to reach any, outside of the TFA, the struggle to reach agreements and stuff like that has been more so because countries are going in different directions. But I think a thing that needs to be explored more in trade broadly, but even more so in digital trade, is interoperability. And it doesn't mean that we need laws to be identical. They can be different, but we do need a similar basis of some sort to build off of for that to exist. And then also another point that you mentioned that I also share is, the example of the US and EU with the privacy shield, and that attempt at, a formulation of some kind of an agreement on interoperability. I mean, it's an example both on the negative and positive. In the positive, being that it's not impossible, right? That could have been successful. And the negative being that the weaknesses of the privacy shield, had they been avoided in terms of like the level of protection, or some of the concerns that the EU had in terms of protection of its private citizens and stuff like that, and their data, if those had been somehow addressed, that might not have failed. So that would have been a bridge between, the EU's data governance model and the US, and that would have worked. But they have totally different governance systems. Yeah. But they would have been able to be successful in the way that, data governance and data protection is interoperable. So I think it's not. I think maybe our investment in time in the regulatory space maybe also needs to be apportioned towards trying to figure out what kind of agreements we need to have then between countries, if it's in FTAs, or DEAs now, or whatever kind of agreements that we need to have in blocks or among countries to make that possible, because it's very evident that countries are not stopping to regulate in this space because no one wants to be called a latecomer, even though they are. Countries are trying to catch up. Countries are trying to address their own national and local concerns. So they will regulate, right? But at the same time, that might be different from what everybody else is doing. But we still need for countries to work together, because especially in the digital and technology space where everything is fluid and everything is online, that is even more important today than maybe when we're talking about trade and goods. That's very different. So there is a need to maybe focus more on how to make interoperability work and how to have those kind of agreements than maybe trying to force harmonization, because I don't know if we'll ever really be able to go back there entirely, given just like, the different priorities that countries have. So that being said, let me just kind of pick up a question that you sorry, at the point that you just raised now as well with regards to standards and stuff, that if we're looking at, international cooperation and multilateralism as maybe a solution for reconciling, these differing national regulations, and we want interoperability to come out of that. Is there a role for international standards, like WIPO, ITU, ISO, and how would developing countries specifically, including Africa, if I might say, play a role in that? Like, how do we, because, this question is coming from the fact that in these spaces, it has mostly been, the digital giants that dominate. And so rules always, or standards always go the way that they want them to. But how do we insert developing countries in there?
So I think I've given this a lot of thought, but I'm not always so sure how multilateral processes become immediately relevant for promoting interoperability in different areas. Not because I don't think they are not promising platforms, but simply because of the practicalities that a lot of these dialogues around promoting interoperability in specific areas, and I don't think it's widespread, but at least in specific areas, particularly in areas related to digital trade facilitation, or digital identities, or very, very fundamental aspects of digital trade are happening more on a bilateral or regional basis. We're seeing a lot of dialogues under digital economy agreements. They often take the nature of informal lawmaking or transnational lawmaking. They are embedded in MOUs and informal understandings rather than binding treaties. And in a way, that's good, I think, because even though it's flexible, it does provide some consensus around a particular area. And one very optimistic example, I know it's very easy to discuss pessimistic examples, but one optimistic example I wanted to discuss was PEPAL, the use of PEPAL standards in e-invoicing. It was a completely bottom-up process, and it started on a voluntary basis. And eventually, many countries now have used the PEPAL standard in e-invoicing, and now it is also often included in some of the recent DEAs. You also find explicit reference to it, and it doesn't come from a international institution. It was very much a bottom-up process coming from a not-for-profit organization. This is much more complicated if you start thinking of how should we have a mechanism for personal data transfers or data security. I think that's the more complicated area where you have to think then of what are the costs, what are the benefits, how to involve all the relevant stakeholders. I think there are some interesting initiatives right now. So the Japanese government, for instance, has set up the institutional arrangement for partnership. And the idea is to create different modules that look at different aspects that would enable cross-border data flows, which they call data free flow with trust. And I think standards discussion would be a very key part of this. I think there are also a lot of these trade and technology councils are discussing this in addition to the digital economy agreements, but it's still very much widespread and not so much centered in one multilateral organization. That's the nature of how it is happening in practice. So I think when we are thinking of interoperability based mechanisms, including whether potentially standards can be more uniform, I think some degree of imperfection and should be accepted. It is a bottom-up process. It has to be flexible. In terms of how developing countries can play a role, I think that's a challenging question, especially countries where there isn't enough digital talent or resources and where they don't have a digital infrastructure, which is, if you don't have the infrastructure, you're not thinking, those are not your concerns, or your concerns could be very different. You could be worried about internet and broadband access while the rest of the world is discussing about the next generation of quantum computing. So it's not really a level playing field, and that makes it difficult. I think you are much better placed than me, Rutendo, to talk about the African perspective, but I think that's a challenge, and I think that gap will always be there. And that's why I suggested something like the borrowing from the TBT principles, which says that standards, if you're adopting them in a trade law context, they need to be open, they need to be representative, they need to be transparent, would increase the potential for more broad-based discussions around it. But I don't think it will ever get rid of this asymmetry that is there. That is just the reality, and I think that gets reflected. Standard setting is very political as well. It's not a neutral, objective, scientific thing all the time, and I think it just reflects the reality of the world that we live in.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'll give a short answer so that we can move forward and maybe address some questions before going on to our closing remarks and questions there. But I do agree with you that it's not very easy, given the digital divide itself, because even though developing countries, some might be further than others and maybe not playing as much catch up, and even though globally we are all learning, even the developed countries still learning about technology and how regulating the space, there is differences in where countries are in terms of their development in this space. So those who are further up will want to do more things that those who are behind don't think are priorities, exactly like what you were saying. So it's also quite difficult given that, and also what you mentioned, with that being a very political process as well. And there's a lot that hinders influence from developing countries in this space. I want to say that united voice, like I've been saying the whole time, would help, but I think it's more than that, because you can have a united voice, but you have to have a position on which you use that united voice on. And if you don't have the necessary know-how or advancements to be able to say, but this is exactly what we want, or understand what it is that you are trying to influence, or rather lobby, then it defeats the purpose, because then you can be easily swayed to believe something that might not be necessarily beneficial for you. And then when you reach a point where it becomes relevant to you, realize that, this is not actually what we should have done. So I think it's quite different. It's difficult, sorry, but I do agree with what you're saying, that it needs to be flexible. I think for now, that's probably the only thing that I can think of as well that would help in this space, that if it's flexible, then it then allows growth and things to change within that space as well, and for countries to see what works and what isn't working. Because if it's rigid, then obviously it denies countries from being able to do that. I don't know if Hildegard, you want to lead us to the questions, or
yes. So we have 2 questions in the chat, so maybe we take up those.
Okay.
First one relates to whether there is actually, if you have personal data protection, does that mean data localization requirements? Is there a link between those? So maybe we start with that.
I can, Rutendo, should I answer? Yeah, I think different countries have different kinds of data protection laws, and it's not necessary that if you have a data protection law, it should have a data localization element. In fact, there are not that many jurisdictions have blanket restrictions on cross-border flows of personal data, although they might have checks in place to ensure that if personal data is going across the borders, it is going to countries where the basic privacy rules and the basic data protection norms that the country has in place are not violated. But the approaches could be very different, because some countries have a more accountability based approach, while other countries are more prescriptive, and they could also have very strong de facto localization requirements for personal data. But it's not necessary that all data protection laws come with data localization requirements. There are many examples where they don't have hard, rigid data localization requirements.
Yeah, I think I don't have much to add on that, because it's very straightforward. But I think one thing that I might say is that there has been some literature that has criticized how, in a way, the EU's conditional transfer method might have some similarities to data localization. It's quite contested, but that's a view as well, that because then there are conditions put on, transfer of data and stuff, you could argue that it is a form of data localization, maybe not the same as what China does. So in that way, you could argue that, but it's not a common view, I must highlight. So that's the only thing that I would add. But I do agree with you, Neha, that countries, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have a data protection framework, it means you have data localization rules. It depends on the region. Countries are doing it relatively different. Like, for example, the US doesn't even have either conditional floor or data localization, but they do have some version of data protection rules.
Yeah, I could see something follow up. If a country does not have data, so what are the other options that country can use instead of data localizations? I think Rutendo highlighted using adequacy-based frameworks, using accountability-based approaches where companies are held accountable. They can transfer personal data wherever they want to, but they are held accountable for complying with those data protection principles. So I think those are some other ways. There are many other ways. I think there's a lot of writing on this as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question, I guess that's all we have time for, and then just a few kind of points on the AFCFT after that. But do you think soft law is kind of toothless in this space, or do you think it's useful?
So in my book, I'm a big fan of soft law. I think especially when you are hitting a big barrier, soft law is a very useful instrument, I think, in many, and it's not just in the context of digital trade. Soft law has been very successful in other contexts as well, especially when either issues are emerging or when there is not yet enough consensus between the countries to figure out what consensus might look like. And I think I mentioned many examples also under the DAs where they're looking at soft law mechanisms, MOUs, informal understandings, and that has created some mechanisms that has enabled digital trade in different ways. I mentioned the example of e-invoicing, but I think other areas such as digital identities also we have seen progress. So I think at the moment it is a good solution, and it's also a great solution in situations where we face so much regulatory and technological uncertainty, because it has the flexibility that a binding treaty mechanism does not have in practice.
I'm just conscious of the time. Do we have any more questions, or should I move on to the AFCFTA segment?
So yeah, please move on to the AFCFT, and we only have a few minutes left, so it has to be very brief. But I think you have actually covered many of the issues implicitly. So let's just focus on a few questions that are specific to AFCFTA. So.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so in reflecting the AFCFTA, I'll only we'll speak about one thing in particular. So I'll only ask one question, and then we'll just answer on that. Which I think will kind of sum up everything that we've kind of been talking about as well. So, I know that your book, Neha, was written prior to, the Digital Trade Protocol of the AFCFTA having come out. But it's still quite relevant to that, like what we've been talking about, right? And how do you think that the AFCFTA's approach to digital trade differs, if at all, from other FTAs with digital trade provisions like the USMCA, DEPA, or even the e-commerce talks at the WTO?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to be very quick on this one, but I'm happy to talk to anybody after the call on any, through email or otherwise. So the general argument has been, so there have been two sides of the argument. So one side of the argument is that the Digital Trade Protocol very much reflects the underlying economic logic that you see in many treaties led by the Western powers, and there's nothing very uniquely African about it. But my reading of the AFCFTA is that actually it has many important and interesting provisions which may be inspired by the Western model of digital trade treaties, but they have a very uniquely African flavor. And I'll quickly highlight some of the things. So for instance, if you look at the preamble of the treaty, there is very strong reference to intra-African policy objectives, to digital inclusion. There is a clear objective of setting a common regional framework for digital trade. The provisions on non-discrimination or cross-border data flows, they look at the African continent as a whole and create opportunities for liberalizing digital trade within the continent. There's a lot of support for interoperability-based solution in different domains of digital regulation, much more than I have seen in any recent, FTA, or even almost comparable to many DEAs that are there out there. It looks at digital infrastructure at a continental level. There is binding language on digital inclusions, on MSMEs. There's language on digital innovation and entrepreneurship within the continent, how to facilitate it, which is not common to many FTAs. There is a focus on multi-stakeholder partnership on digital skills. And finally, very quickly, I'll say there's also provisions on technical assistance and capacity building, which are far more detailed and binding than anything we have seen in FTAs. And of course, we know the language has been watered down in the e-commerce, the JSI on e-commerce. So there are many innovations. So I see a lot of promising aspects, provided the annexes provide enough boost to implementing these provisions.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say, conscious of time, is I do agree with you that there is a lot of promise with this instrument. Of course, the truth of the matter will be with what will be in the annexes, but also how it will be implemented, right? Because we have seen other promising instruments maybe not having been implemented in the region, like the Malabo Convention. But as of now, what I would say is that there's been criticism from some, academics that it does follow what the US is doing, which is not a lie. There is some US-like language in some of the provisions, which then suggests that maybe it is following the US example in that context. But then there is also new ideas that might be argued to be, if not developing country specific, then Africa specific. And right now I'm thinking of how, with regards to cross-border data flows, there is US-like language in terms of prohibiting, data localization, but then in the same breath, there is softer language, which is not binding, but more so indicative of where the heart of the instrument is, because then it does say that members can encourage. I encourage to then support and wait. Sorry, let me just quickly go to the text of it. I should have it here somewhere. That they shall encourage and support the establishment and use of computing facilities to promote the development of local digital infrastructure access. And that is something that we also haven't seen anywhere else. They are allowing for that development in terms of digital infrastructure. And if that needs to be done through data localization, so be it, which is something that we haven't seen, that juxtaposition of those two approaches being so boldly included in one instrument back to back, like literally in the same provision. So, yeah. That's just one example. There are a few other examples of how it has, maybe replicated other more prominent stances, but then also kind of tried to push back on maybe other things that might be specifically African in this context. So yeah, I think it does differ in a way, but it also is not maybe 100% different. That's what I'd say. So maybe it's, I don't know what the percentage would be there, but yeah, there are some similarities, but there are also some differences. I think that's the thing to say. Yeah, so I think my last remarks would just be to thank everyone for joining us. I really have enjoyed talking to you, Neha, and about your book, which, again, I should highlight that you said it's open access, so please go ahead and read it, especially because it's it has developing country commentary, which I'm really excited about. But yeah, I'll hand back to you, Hildegard, and then yeah, thank you.
So I would also like to add my thanks to the panelists. It has been a great conversation and so much insights, and I've really learned a lot about this from a legal perspective. And let me also just address a question which is in the chat, that asking about whether you can share this on LinkedIn, and yes, you can. It's going to be posted on YouTube. So feel free to chat about it in social media. So, but back to just wrapping up this, I think it has been a great, insightful discussion. And just to finalize, I think I would like to pick up on one topic that I think Rutendo mentioned, and that is we are in a position now that things are in a flux. We don't know exactly how this should be regulated. And that is really a sweet spot to try to get it right and bring everybody together in the first place, and not having to harmonize 20 years from now when everybody is running in different directions. So I think that's an important point to make, that now is the time that we should really discuss and see if we can find some common ground in this space before we run off in all directions. So with that, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure and a learning experience to listen to you. So thank you. And also thanks to the audience.